I took the assignment because it was quiet work, and because quiet work was all I was allowed to want at that point in my life. The station sat in a fold of the Appalachian hills, where the road narrowed and the trees leaned in like they were listening. From the porch, I could see a long stretch of trailhead gravel and the first mile of forest beyond it, a place most hikers treated like a photo opportunity before turning back. My job was simple on paper: log names, check permits, make sure gates were locked at dusk, and write down anything that looked out of place. The building hummed with old wiring and the smell of burnt coffee, and the radio crackled every few hours with routine check-ins. Nothing about it felt dangerous. The days moved slow, marked by shadows shifting across the floor and the sound of wind moving through leaves. If something felt off, I told myself it was just the isolation doing what isolation always does. The first odd detail showed up in the logbook, not the woods. I noticed the same boot prints near the maintenance shed 3 mornings in a row, clean impressions pressed into dust that should have been disturbed by vehicles. They were a common size, nothing remarkable, and they never pointed toward the trail or the road. They just appeared, parallel to the fence, like someone had walked there and then been erased. I brushed them away with my boot and wrote nothing down, because writing nothing down felt easier. Later that night, when the radio hissed awake on its own, I assumed a storm was rolling in somewhere far off. The sound wasn't speech, just a repeating pulse that came and went at regular intervals. I turned the volume down and kept filling out forms, telling myself that old equipment likes to pretend it's alive. Over the next few days, small things collected at the edges of my attention. A gate I knew I had locked stood open by a few inches. A trail marker leaned at a new angle, as if adjusted by careful hands. Birds lifted all at once from a stand of trees without a clear reason, then settled again as if embarrassed. I wrote down weather changes and mileage checks, but I skipped the rest. It felt important not to overreact, to keep everything ordinary by treating it as ordinary. When the delivery truck didn't show on Friday, I told myself the road must have washed out somewhere. When the boot prints returned, deeper this time, I told myself they belonged to a contractor who hadn't signed in. By Sunday evening, the hills were quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. And I realized I had been listening for something all along, not because I expected to hear it, but because the silence felt practiced. I stayed on the porch until dark, watching the tree line, waiting without knowing for what exactly to happen soon. Asterisk by the second week. The routine had settled into something mechanical, which made the changes harder to notice until they were already there. I woke before dawn, checked the locks, logged the weather, and walked the same short loop past the shed and back fence. The boot prints kept appearing, always overnight, always the same distance from the fence line, as if whoever made them was careful not to cross it. I measured the space once with my stride and found it matched the width of the service road exactly, a detail that stayed with me longer than it should have. The radio interference returned each night at nearly the same minute, a steady pulse that rose and fell, never drifting into speech. I started writing down the times in the margins of the logbook, not as an incident report, but as a habit, the way you might jot down when the kettle whistles. When I compared the notes after a few days, the pattern lined up with my own movements, strongest when I was outside and weakest when I stayed in, which made me feel watched without giving me anything solid to react to. Calls came in from nearby towns about small issues that didn't warrant a response, a porch light that failed after being replaced twice, a trail camera that recorded hours of empty footage where motion should have triggered it, a dog that refused to go past the end of its driveway. None of it belonged to me, and none of it rose to the level of concern that would move resources. But the similarities pressed together in my head. On a slow afternoon, I pulled an old map from a drawer, the kind printed before the last set of updates, and noticed a section along the ridge had been neatly cut out, the edges straight as if done with a ruler. The absence felt intentional, more deliberate than a printing error. I put the map back and told myself it was outdated for a reason. That night, the interference came earlier, the pulse tighter, closer together, like someone testing a signal. I turned the radio off, and the room felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stepped onto the porch and saw the prints again, fresh, leading along the fence and stopping at the gate I had checked minutes before. The latch was closed, but the metal was warm, holding heat longer than it should have. I stood there longer than necessary, counting the seconds between pulses I could no longer hear, and realized the unease wasn't coming from any single thing. It was the sense that whatever was happening was patient, willing to repeat itself as many times as it took until I noticed, and that noticing was the point. I wrote everything down then, not because I understood it, but because leaving blank space felt like permission, and I wasn't ready to give that yet. Asterisk by the third week. The repetition had started to feel intentional, like a test I wasn't told I was taking. I stopped brushing away the boot prints and began photographing them instead, always from the same angle, always with the fence post in frame. When I laid the images side by side on the old desktop, the spacing was identical every time, down to the scuff on the left heel. It didn't matter if it rained or if the ground was dry, the impressions adjusted just enough to stay readable. The radio pulse continued its schedule, but now there were gaps, brief silences that fell exactly when I stepped into certain areas of the station grounds. I tried standing still, tried moving faster, tried turning the radio back on mid-pulse, but the pattern adapted without reacting, as if it didn't need to acknowledge me directly. Reports from outside the area began to overlap more clearly, the same phrases used by different people who didn't know each other, describing the feeling of being watched without seeing anyone, the sense that something nearby was measuring distance rather than approaching. I was told not to worry about it, that stress makes people compare notes that don't belong together, but the advice came with an instruction to stop logging minor irregularities. That instruction bothered me more than the irregularities themselves. I took a drive along the service road that wasn't on my official route, the one I had only seen referenced in old maintenance notes. It ended at a turnout fenced off with new wire and clean locks. No warning signs, no explanation. The trees around it were undisturbed, but the ground near the fence showed marks where something had been dragged lightly back and forth, shallow lines like a rehearsal. I didn't cross the fence. I didn't need to. The air there felt flat, sound traveling poorly, my own footsteps dull and close. When I returned to the station, I found my chair moved a few inches from where I had left it, the mug by the sink still warm. There was no sign of a break-in, no forced entry, nothing missing, which made it worse. That night, the radio clicked on by itself without the pulse, open and waiting, and I realized I had started to recognize the timing without checking the clock. I shut it off and sat in the dark, listening to the building settle, to the distant movement of the woods. It occurred to me then that the pattern wasn't escalating the way stories usually do. It wasn't rushing. It was stabilizing, like it had found the range it wanted. The idea that this might be the final shape of things, rather than a prelude, stayed with me until morning. By the fourth week, avoidance stopped working, not because I felt braver, but because the station itself narrowed my choices. The maintenance trail appeared again on a clipboard schedule that hadn't been updated in years, penciled in with today's date in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I followed it at mid-morning, telling myself daylight makes everything reasonable, and the woods agreed, just long enough to let me forget the radio. The path dipped and rose, cutting through stands of hemlock that blocked the wind until the fenced turnout came into view. The locks were different this time. Heavier, their keys stamped with numbers instead of letters. On the ground, a straight chalk line ran parallel to the fence, refreshed recently, with small ticks marking distance like someone checking a margin. I stood outside it and waited, listening for the pulse that never came, noticing how my own breathing sounded loud and close. I didn't cross the line. I didn't need to. The feeling was immediate, a pressure without direction, as if the space beyond the fence resisted being observed. I took notes the way I always had, careful, plain, writing what I could verify and nothing else. When I turned back, my radio clicked once, not a pulse, just a clean acknowledgement. Back at the station, a sealed envelope waited on the desk, with my name typed neatly, no return address. Inside was a revised route map, official stamps fresh, the cutout section restored but blank, all details removed. A note instructed me to begin nightly checks along the fence and to stop photographing the prints. There was no explanation and no signature. That evening, the supply road blocked itself without warning. Not a fallen tree, not a vehicle, just a line of orange cones placed with careful spacing, reflective bands catching my headlights. They weren't there an hour earlier. I backed up and called it in, reporting exactly what I saw. The reply came calm and delayed, advising me to wait until morning. I shut the engine off and sat in the dark, counting the seconds between my own thoughts, realizing the roadblock faced inward, not out. When I returned on foot, the station lights were on. Inside, my chair had been moved again, this time closer to the radio. The logbook lay open to a blank page with the date already filled in. I wrote until my hand cramped, not conclusions, just measurements, times, positions, the ordinary shapes of things. Somewhere beyond the fence, something matched my patience with its own, and the quiet felt arranged to see how long I would keep writing. I slept poorly, waking to the sense of being counted rather than watched, as if presence mattered more than sight. At dawn the cones were gone, the locks unchanged, the chalk line crisp. The radio stayed silent. I logged that too. Understanding silence had become another measurable condition. I stayed on schedule, because schedules were the only things here that still pretended to choose. Asterisk by the 5th week? The situation stopped feeling optional. Not dramatic, just fixed. Like a door that has quietly locked itself behind you. The nightly fence checks became the center of everything, their timing precise enough that I could feel the minutes compress as I walked. The chalk line had multiplied into several, each refreshed, each marked with careful ticks that matched distances I recognized from the station layout. I stopped pretending these were unrelated details and focused on doing the work exactly as instructed. The radio stayed silent, which was worse than the pulse, because silence offered no rhythm to measure against. On a supply run just before dusk, I found the road blocked again, this time by something heavier than cones, an object placed squarely across the lane, too uniform to be debris and too dull to reflect light. I parked and approached on foot, stopping at a distance that felt chosen for me. The surface showed no marks, no seams, nothing to suggest where it came from. It wasn't there to stop traffic. It was there to confirm a boundary. I reported it and received the same calm reply. Advising patience, advising nothing else. Walking back, I noticed the woods behaving differently, not louder or quieter, just coordinated. Sounds rising and falling together like a single breath. At the station, a new clipboard hung by the door with my name printed at the top, the checkboxes already half filled in. I didn't remember completing them, but the handwriting matched mine closely enough to make arguing feel useless. The logbook contained entries I hadn't written, all factual, all restrained, all accurate. Times matched my movements. Measurements matched my tools. Whoever had written them knew how I recorded things and respected the limits I set. That night, during the check, I stood at the fence and felt the pressure again. Not fear exactly, more like attention, steady and unhurried. I counted the ticks on the chalk line and realized they matched my average stride. I stepped back once, then forward again, and the sensation eased, as if alignment mattered. Inside. The radio clicked on without sound, the indicator light steady. I left it that way and sat at the desk, writing until the page ended, then turning to the next. The idea that this could be a misunderstanding no longer fit the evidence I had. The idea that it was hostile didn't fit either. It felt procedural, as if I had been folded into a process that didn't require my agreement, only my consistency. Near dawn, I found my jacket laid out by the door, clean, pockets arranged, keys placed where my hand expected them. I put it on without thinking and completed the last check before sunrise. The object on the road was gone. The chalk lines were crisp. The fence held. When the sun came up, the hills looked ordinary again, and that ordinariness felt like a confirmation rather than a relief. I logged everything, understanding that avoidance had ended, and what remained was participation, measured carefully, quietly, one recorded step at a time. Asterisk on the final night. The station felt settled in a way that made me uneasy, as if everything had found its place without consulting me. I followed the checklist because it was there, because it matched the cadence my days had taken on, because deviating no longer felt like a choice worth testing. The fence lines were clean, the chalk marks precise, and the distances measured true against my stride. I paused at the turnout and waited, not for a signal, but for confirmation that waiting still mattered. The woods held steady, sounds layered and balanced, neither approaching nor receding. When I returned inside, the radio was on, its light steady, no pulse, no noise, just open. The logbook lay to a fresh page with the date typed neatly. The margins ruled. I wrote what I could verify, and nothing more, noting the absence of interference, the removal of the roadblock, the unchanged locks. The entries felt complete before I finished them, as if the act of writing closed a circuit. Near midnight, I found a thin folder on the desk labeled with my name and a status line marked complete. Inside were copies of my own logs, photographs I had taken, measurements I recognized, and a final form that required no signature. It stated that the assignment had ended and that further presence was unnecessary. The language was careful and neutral, the kind used to conclude a routine process. I packed slowly, leaving items where they belonged, keeping the order intact. Outside, the tree line looked the same as it always had, ordinary and dense, offering nothing back. I locked the door, checked the fence once more, and walked to my vehicle without hurrying. The road was clear. The drive down felt shorter, the curves familiar, the radio silent. At the last bend, I stopped and looked back, expecting something to break the symmetry, but nothing did. In town, the lights were on and people moved through their evenings without pause. My phone showed missed notifications that resolved themselves when I opened them, timestamps aligning as if they had waited. Days passed. I slept. I tried not to count. Still, small alignments followed me. A chair nudged closer to a desk. A schedule updated before I checked it. A margin ruled where I hadn't drawn one. When I returned to the hills weeks later, not to the station, but to the overlook, the fence was visible through the trees, lines faint but present. I stood at a distance that felt correct and waited until the feeling eased. I didn't cross. I wrote this down afterward, understanding that completion didn't mean finished, only that the measurements now included me wherever I went. It remains unclear whether the records closed because the place changed or because I learned how to fit within its margins, measuring myself quietly, keeping distance, letting silence do its work, and recognizing that some assignments conclude without ever really ending, and waiting without certainty for instructions that arrive.